Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography. I'm Mark Wallace, hanging out with Ilba. Hey, today's episode is sponsored by AiArty. It's an amazing image enhancement software that we're going to be getting to in a little bit, but I want to tell you what we're going to be doing today in this episode. And before I forget, Ilba doesn't speak a word of English, and so todo es bien. Yo hablo en español un poquito, sí, un poquito. So I might be zipping over into español to communicate a little bit, but if Ilba looks like she doesn't know what's going on, it's because she doesn't know what's going on, like right now. So this is going to be a lot of fun. So what we're going to be doing today is, if you'll notice back here, we've got all this light coming into this window. It's very, very bright. It's coming in, and we're inside this little apartment, and it's dark in here. In fact, if we look at the other camera, you can see that Ilba and I, we are silhouettes. There's no light hitting us from this side, and so we want to balance the light that we can't control with the light that we can control. We're going to balance the ambient light with the light from a flash. So how do we do that? Well, we do that with something I call the exposure diamond. So we know that we use the exposure triangle to balance ambient light. So we have the ISO, we have our aperture, and we have our shutter speed. By adjusting those three things, we can control our ambient light. Our light from the flash uses two of those three things, our ISO and our aperture, but it also uses the flash power. In other words, how much power we put on our flash, from full power, half power, quarter power. So that is the exposure diamond, or exposure triangle for our flash. And if we put those together, then we get an exposure diamond. So we have our ISO and our aperture. Those two things control both exposures, but the shutter only controls the ambient light, and the flash power only controls the light from the flash. We can control these two things independent of each other and do some really groovy things, and that's what we're going to do. So let's begin by working with the exposure triangle to expose our ambient light, because we can't control it. We have to respond to it. So, Ilba, ¿tú estás lista? Perfecto. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is I need to set my camera to manual mode. So for this demo, we're going to set it in manual mode so I can really dive in and show you what's happening. So I'm going to choose as my starting point a shutter speed of 60th of a second. Why 60th of a second? Well, I want to be able to change my ambient light exposure up or down, and so I know at 60th of a second I can go up to 125th or 250th of a second and change the background brighter or darker. And so I want to start sort of at a middle ground, so 60th of a second. I also want to set my aperture value to 7.1. Why 7.1? Well, because when we finally get to our final exposure, the ISO is going to be sort of high in this camera, so I know that to get a nice proper exposure for my flash, I need to have my aperture closed down a little bit, or I'm going to overpower this flash. And I know that because we rehearsed this beforehand. So we have two parts of the exposure triangle. I have 60th of a second at f7.1. So what is the ISO value? Well, to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to point my camera to the ambient light, and I'm going to look at my meter, and then I'm just going to roll my exposure, or my ISO value, until I get a proper exposure. So when I'm looking at the ambient light at 800, ISO 800, my meter is telling me I have a proper exposure. So I'm just going to take a picture of the outside, and we can look at that, and you can see that everything is exposed properly. So I know my ambient light is exposed properly. So 1/60th of a second, f7.1 at an ISO value of 800. So when we shoot with those values, okay, Ilba, perfecto. All right. Perfecto. Okay. And when we look at that photo, you can see that she is totally underexposed. And so we need to fix that. So we can fix that by turning on our flash. But we can't just turn on our flash and let it, fire away. We need to make sure we've balanced that. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I have a little remote here. So this little remote allows me to make my flash fire. I'm going to put that on my camera. So what I want to do is I'm going to use my light meter. So my light meter allows me to put in two values, and it will solve for the third. And so I'm going to put in my shutter speed. So my shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. So I'll put that in. And then my ISO value is 800. I'll put that in. Great. Now, when I meter this, my light meter will tell me what the proper aperture value is. And right now, it's telling me it's f8. I don't know if you can see that. It's saying it's f8. So that's a little bit bright. So I'm going to take my flash. I'm going to turn the power down on my flash. So now we're on this exposure triangle, the flash exposure triangle. So our ISO, our aperture are set. Now we're just playing with the flash power to get this to be correct. So I'm going to meter this one more time. I'm metering that. It still looks a little bit bright. It's metering at f8. I'll take that value down. I'm doing this sort of slow so we can illustrate that. Okay, now it meters at the proper value. So that's 7.1 on this meter. Let's take a photo. Okay, lista, tu ojos aquí, por favor, perfecto. And I'm going to take this shot. Perfecto. Okay, we can see, wow, muy linda. We can see that this looks great, except we have one huge problem. And you probably can see that we have a reflection in the window of this light. So that's bouncing in the window. So how do we fix that? Well, we could do a few different things. We could move this light. We could put a grid on that. We could do some stuff. But for this demo, we really just want to focus on balancing the light. We're going to get to making some beautiful portraits a little bit later. So the easiest way to solve this problem is for me to walk over here and just open the window. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's take a moment to learn about the sponsor of this episode, AiArty. AiArty is an amazing image enhancement tool. And with AiArty, you can effortlessly improve the quality of your photos by removing blur, noise, and pixelation with 3 distinct AI models for super resolution. It only takes one click to enhance blurry, grainy, pixelated, and soft images while generating more details using AI. This is great for restoring compressed or highly pixelated files. Use deep learning algorithms to remove noise and reconstruct your images. You can fix issues caused by high ISO, underexposure, or noise from highly compressed files. Improve the clarity, sharpness, and overall visual quality of your work. Use AiArty to preserve and generate image details. It's perfect for generating skin, hair, textures, lines, and other fine details. The lower the quality of the image, the greater the potential for improvement. Make your images more detailed and natural by emphasizing edges and fine details without creating artifacts. A big thank you to AiArty for sponsoring this episode. For more information about AiArty and to download the software, click the link in the description of this video. All right, let's get back to it. Woohoo! Ah, that feels so much better. It's a little toasty in here. Now, let's take a shot with no window. Okay, perfecto. Muy linda. Sí, por favor. My Spanish is so bad. Okay, now we can see that we've got this well-balanced shot. It looks good, but for my taste, it looks almost as if Ilba has been photoshopped in because of the quality of this flash. It's not a very large modifier. I wish I had a much larger modifier, but I don't. So what can I do? Well, I can change my flash exposure, or I could change my ambient light exposure because we have these 2 parts of our exposure diamond. So let me show you that first. So the first thing I'm going to do is remember, with our exposure triangle over here with the ambient light, our ISO and our aperture are set, but changing the shutter will change that ambient light. And over here, our ISO and our aperture are set, but by changing the flash power, we can change the exposure of the flash. So let's do both of those things. First, we're going to change the ambient light. And so the first thing we're going to do, Ilba, por favor, tu dedo. Sí. Uno. So this is a normal exposure, 1/60th of a second. And then we're going to do the second one, por favor, dos. 1/25th of a second, now at 200, tres. Perfecto. Okay, when we look at these photos, you can see that Ilba is staying the same. Her exposure is the same, but the background is changing. By changing that shutter speed, I'm able to take the background exposure, the ambient light exposure, and make it darker, but I'm leaving the flash exposure alone. So that is working just fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my shutter speed back to 60. Now we're going to do the opposite. Okay, so Ilba, por favor, tú es lista. Tu dedo uno, Okay, this is the normal flash exposure. Now I'm going to take my flash and I'm going to take that down, and we're going to take a second. So dos. Okay, I'm going to take it down a little bit more. Tres. Perfecto. Now when we look at these photos, you can see that the background is staying the same, but the flash exposure is changing. And that's the glory of the flash exposure, or the exposure diamond. We can control either our ambient light, or we can control the light from the flash to make sure we get a nice balance between the two. Okay, now that we know how all of this works, we're going to put it into practice. We're actually going to try to get a little bit better quality of light, some better poses, better scenery. We're going to shoot Ilba in maybe on the balcony, on the porch, around here. We're going to do some different things. To put this into practice, we're going to speed it up and show you how this works in real life. We can see we have a really nice sunny day, but outside we've got these great plants. And so what we want to do is we want to use that as the background. But because the sun is coming in from this direction, her face is going to be underexposed. So what we're going to need to do is add a flash so we get a nice balanced exposure. Well, there's a huge difference between the light that's coming from the sky and the shadows on this side. In fact, so much so that we need this video light to be turned on just so you can see my face. But we're going to work with this. So the first thing we need to do always is expose for the ambient light and figure out our posing and that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, lista? Perfecto, por favor, aquí. And so what we're going to do first is I want to shoot with a shallow depth of field. So I'm going to shoot at about 4.5. And then I'll set my shutter speed to around 100 or so. And then I'll adjust my ISO accordingly. I don't want it to be too high. But let's just see how we do. So right here at 4.5, I can see that my ISO value at about 200 and a shutter speed of 100, I get a nice perfecto, perfecto. So yeah, okay, this is fantastic. So we've got a nice soft portrait here. We've got all this foliage and greenery. But we need to fill in those shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure my light is turned on. I'm going to turn on my remote control on my camera. Let's meter this. So we want this to meter at about 4.5. That's where we're set right now. And so I'm going to turn my meter on. I'm going to make sure that my shutter speed is set to 100. That matches my camera. My ISO is set to 200. That matches my camera. And now, let's meter that. And por favor, un poquito más. Sí. Perfecto. And then, okay. Well, I got really lucky. That just happened to meter right at 4.4, 4.0. And I can try to maybe increase that just a touch to get it to 4.5. Let's see. But I think, yeah, now we're at 4.5. So now this meter reading is saying that the flash exposure is going to match our ambient light exposure. So our two sides of our triangle are matching. And so let's take a shot and see how this looks. Okay, lista, perfecta. Me gusta mucho. Me gusta. Perfecto. Okay, let's take a look. Oh, look at that. Now we are cooking with gas. Look at this. ¿Te gusta? Okay. She likes it. Me gusta means I like it. ¿Te gusta? Do you like it? She said yes. We got an oh my God. All right, so now that we have a shot, what I'm going to do is, this is a horizontal shot for the video. I'm going to start shooting vertical shots. Perfecta, por favor. Y tu cuerpo, un poquito. Sí, perfecto. And so we are playing with this. And now we can really start moving. And this looks like we're at a nice tropical beach somewhere. It looks really nice. We're going to shoot this, see what we get. I'll show you the results, and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, let's review. If you want to balance your flash with the ambient light, you use the exposure diamond to do that. Your ISO and your aperture value will affect both exposures, the flash and the ambient light. But the shutter only affects the ambient light, and the flash power only affects the light from the flash. So you can adjust those two things and it'll all work out. Remember, start with the ambient light because you can't control it. Lock in that exposure and then adjust your flash accordingly, and then you can season to taste. You can increase or decrease the shutter speed to allow more ambient light or to eliminate some ambient light. You can increase or decrease how much of that flash you're filling in. You can just create your own style and it's gonna work out. Gracias, Ilba. Todo bien, todo dia. Muy bien. It's been fantastic working with Ilba. This is her very first video and very first photo shoot, so woohoo, we finished. Thanks so much for joining. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and if you're not a member, you're missing out on a ton of great stuff, in-depth, long-form classes. Those are for our members, so check that out. You can click the join button, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks so much. I'll see you again next time.